Darrell Edward Brooks Jr. was born on February 7, 1982, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. By the time the public learned his name, it would already be too late. Brooks did not emerge suddenly as a mass killer. He was the product of a long documented pattern of violence, ignored warnings, and judicial leniency. His case would become one of the most disturbing examples of how a man already deemed dangerous was allowed back into society only to commit one of the deadliest acts of mass violence in recent American history while out on bond. Brooks' early life was defined by instability. Raised primarily by his mother, he struggled with behavioral issues from a young age. Teachers described him as disruptive, aggressive, and prone to violent outbursts. By adolescence, he had already begun accumulating a criminal record that included domestic abuse, weapons violations, and repeated assaults. Violence was not an anomaly in Brooks' life, it was a constant. As an adult, Brooks developed a long history of domestic violence, particularly against women he was romantically involved with. Police records show multiple incidents where he physically assaulted partners, threatened them with vehicles, and ignored restraining orders. In several cases, he used cars as weapons, an ominous pattern that would later culminate in mass murder. Despite this history, Brooks was repeatedly released on low bail or no bail at all. Courts acknowledged his violent tendencies, yet continued to grant him freedom under the assumption that he would comply with legal conditions. This assumption would prove fatal. In November 2021, Brooks was arrested for running over the mother of his child with an SUV during a domestic dispute. The act itself was brutal and deliberate. Witnesses described him accelerating toward her, striking her, and fleeing the scene. Prosecutors charged him with reckless endangerment and domestic abuse-related offenses. Given his record, the charges were serious. The risk was clear, yet Brooks was released on a bond of just $1,000. 6 days later, on November 21, 2021, the city of Waukesha, Wisconsin, was celebrating its annual Christmas parade. Families lined the streets, children waved from sidewalks, bands marched, elderly community members sat bundled in blankets, smiling as floats passed by. It was the kind of event that symbolized safety, tradition, and communal trust. Darrell Brooks drove his red SUV directly into it. Video footage later showed the vehicle accelerating through barricades and plowing into crowds at full speed. Brooks did not stop. He did not slow down. He swerved intentionally, striking parade participants one after another. People were thrown into the air, instruments shattered, bodies crumpled onto the pavement. 6 people were killed. Dozens more were injured, many critically. Children were among the wounded. Some victims lost limbs. Others would never fully recover from brain trauma, spinal injuries, or psychological scars that would last a lifetime. Witnesses described screams, confusion, and blood everywhere. Parents searched frantically for children. First responders arrived to scenes of mass trauma usually reserved for war zones or terrorist attacks. But this was not an act of terrorism. It was something more unsettling. It was preventable. When Brooks was apprehended shortly after the attack, he showed no visible remorse. During interrogation and later in court, he attempted to shift blame, derail proceedings, and portray himself as a victim of the system. His courtroom behavior would become infamous, marked by hostility, disruption, and a complete lack of empathy for the dead and injured. As the investigation unfolded, public outrage grew not only toward Brooks, but toward the system that allowed him to walk free days earlier. Prosecutors, judges, and policymakers were forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How could a man with a documented history of violent behavior, especially using vehicles as weapons, be released so easily? Why were warning signs ignored again and again? The trial became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in modern U.S. history. Survivors testified about the moment their lives were shattered. Parents spoke of children who would never walk again. Families described empty chairs at dinner tables that would never be filled. Brooks was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus hundreds of additional years for related offenses. The sentence ensured he would never again walk free, but the damage was already done. The Waukesha parade attack became a defining case study in bail reform debates across the country. Critics argued that public safety had been sacrificed in the name of leniency, while others pointed to systemic failures in risk assessment and enforcement. Regardless of political stance, one fact remained indisputable: Darrell Brooks should not have been on the street. The aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. The city of Waukesha was permanently changed. Annual traditions now carried an undercurrent of fear. Survivors required lifelong medical care. First responders carried trauma from scenes they could not forget. Trust in institutions meant to protect was deeply shaken. Darrell Brooks did not snap. He did not act out of nowhere. He followed a trajectory that was visible, documented, and repeatedly ignored. His release on bond was not an accident, it was a decision, and that decision cost 6 lives. The chilling question left behind is not just why Brooks killed, but how many warnings it takes before society intervenes. Because in this case, the system didn't just fail to stop a killer, it handed him the keys. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, into one of the wealthiest real estate families in New York City. He grew up surrounded by privilege, insulation, and power advantages that would later allow him to bend legal systems, manipulate investigations, and repeatedly escape consequences. But wealth alone does not explain why Durst became one of the most chilling figures in modern American crime. His case stands apart because of one brutal, undeniable fact. While out on bond for a killing already under investigation, Robert Durst murdered again. Durst's descent into violence did not begin suddenly. It unfolded slowly, hidden behind money, silence, and the protective shadow of a powerful family. As a child, Durst witnessed the suicide of his mother, who fell or was rumored to have been pushed from the roof of the family's home. He was just 7 years old. That moment would later be revisited by psychologists as a potential catalyst for his emotional detachment and inability to process empathy. Family members described him as withdrawn, cold, and emotionally distant. Even among the wealthy Dursts, Robert was considered different. By adulthood, he had developed a reputation for erratic behavior. He abused drugs, isolated himself, and struggled to maintain relationships. Yet none of this prevented him from living comfortably off family wealth. He never needed to work. He never needed to answer to anyone. In 1971, Robert married Kathleen "Kathy" McCormack, a bright and ambitious woman studying to become a doctor. Friends later described the marriage as deeply troubled. Durst was controlling, paranoid, and emotionally abusive. Kathy confided to friends that she feared her husband and believed he might kill her. On January 31, 1982, Kathy Durst vanished. Robert claimed he dropped her off at a train station after an argument. No one ever saw her again. Despite mounting suspicions, no body was found, and no charges were filed. Durst's wealth, influence, and legal firepower ensured that the case stalled. Kathy Durst became one of New York's most haunting missing persons cases, an absence that would follow Robert Durst for the rest of his life. For nearly 2 decades, Durst lived freely. But in 2000, his past finally began catching up with him. That year, authorities reopened the investigation into Kathy's disappearance. Media attention surged. Investigators began circling closer, and one woman, in particular, worried Durst deeply: Suzanne Berman. Susan Berman was Durst's longtime friend and confidant. She knew his secrets. She had helped him craft alibis. She had spoken to police in the past, and she was beginning to talk again. On December 24, 2000, Susan Berman was found dead in her Beverly Hills home. She had been shot execution-style in the back of the head. The crime scene was clean, controlled, and unmistakably personal. There were no signs of struggle, no robbery, just a single bullet and silence. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Robert Durst. Phone records placed him in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. Witnesses recalled seeing him near Berman's home. Motive was clear. She knew too much. But once again, Durst avoided immediate consequences. He fled. Durst went on the run, disguising himself as a mute woman and living under an alias in Galveston, Texas. There, in a decaying apartment complex, he lived among society's margins, far removed from his Manhattan pen. In September 2001, his past caught up with him again. Durst was arrested for shoplifting a sandwich and a bandit. Police soon discovered his true identity. More disturbingly, they also discovered something else: body parts floating in Galveston Bay. The remains belonged to Morris Black, Durst's neighbor. Durst admitted he killed Black, dismembered his body, and dumped it into the water, but he claimed it was self-defense, in an outcome that stunned the nation. Robert Durst was acquitted of murder in 2003. His defense team argued that he acted in fear and panic. The jury believed him. Yet even after admitting to dismembering a man, Durst was granted bond, and while out on bond, free to move, free to travel, and free from supervision strict enough to stop him, he had already committed another murder. The killing of Susan Berman occurred while Durst was actively under suspicion and legal pressure related to Kathy's disappearance. He was not a free man in the moral sense. He was under scrutiny. He was cornered, and the system let him walk. For years after the Galveston acquittal, Durst lived openly. He gave interviews. He taunted journalists. He spoke casually about death. His wealth allowed him to hire elite legal teams that delayed, redirected, and obstructed justice at every turn. It wasn't until 2015, 15 years after Susan Berman's murder, that Durst was finally arrested and charged for killing her. The arrest came just one day before the final episode of a documentary series aired, one in which Durst, caught on a hot microphone, appeared to confess. The trial revealed the full picture. Evidence showed Durst traveled across the country, specifically to confront Berman. He brought a weapon. He silenced her permanently. And then he returned to New York, leaving behind a corpse and another unanswered question. In 2021, Robert Durst was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Susan Berman and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in custody in 2022, but for many, justice came far too late. Kathy Durst was never found. Morris Black lost his life. Susan Berman died because she knew the truth, and all of it happened because money, influence, and a broken system repeatedly gave Robert Durst something he should never have had: freedom. The chilling reality of this case is not just that Durst murdered while out on bond, it's that he did so calmly, deliberately, and with the full confidence that he would get away with it again. And for a very long time, he was right. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario, Canada. By the early 1990s, his name would become synonymous with calculated sadism, sexual violence, and systemic failure. But one fact remains at the center of his story, often overshadowed by the horror of his crimes. Paul Bernardo committed multiple murders while out on bail. Despite overwhelming warning signs, forensic evidence, and repeated opportunities to stop him, his case would become one of the most devastating examples of what happens when a justice system hesitates in the face of obvious danger. Bernardo's childhood was marked by instability, secrecy, and abuse. Raised in a seemingly ordinary suburban household, he struggled socially and academically. Behind closed doors, he was subjected to emotional manipulation and later revealed to have been abused by a neighbor during adolescence. Psychologists would later identify this period as foundational in the development of his violent sexual fantasies and compulsive need for domination. By his late teens, Bernardo had begun committing sexual assaults. He stalked neighborhoods, breaking into homes and attacking women at night. These crimes escalated rapidly in both frequency and brutality. Victims described a masked attacker who was methodical, confident, and cruel, someone who derived pleasure not only from the assault, but from terror itself. Throughout the late 1980s, Toronto and surrounding areas were gripped by fear of a serial rapist known as the Scarborough Rapist. Police received dozens of reports. Composite sketches were circulated. DNA evidence was collected. The pattern was undeniable, and Paul Bernardo was already on their radar. In 1990, Bernardo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault related to the Scarborough Rapist attacks. The evidence against him was substantial. Victim descriptions matched him. His behavior aligned with the offender profile. Most critically, DNA samples were taken, samples that, if processed in time, would have conclusively linked him to the rapes. But the DNA testing was delayed, and while the system stalled, Paul Bernardo was released on bail, free to return home, free to continue offending, free to escalate. While out on bail, Bernardo's violence did not slow, it intensified. In December 1990, he abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahoney. He held her captive, sexually assaulted her, and ultimately murdered her. Her dismembered body was later found encased in concrete blocks and dumped in a lake. At the time of her murder, Bernardo was legally presumed innocent. He was awaiting trial. He was under conditions meant to protect the public. Those conditions failed completely. Less than a year later, in April 1992, while still out on bail and under active investigation, Bernardo abducted another teenage girl, 15-year-old Kristen French. She was taken in broad daylight from a church parking lot. For 3 days, she was held captive, tortured, and sexually assaulted before being murdered. Both murders occurred after Bernardo had already been charged with violent sexual crimes. Both occurred while he was free on bail. Both were entirely preventable. The full scope of Bernardo's crimes would later reveal an even deeper layer of betrayal and horror. His wife at the time, Carla Homolka, was not only aware of his violence, she actively participated. Together, they recorded assaults. They planned abductions. They normalized brutality within the walls of their home, while presenting themselves as an ordinary young couple to the outside world. When investigators finally connected the dots, the revelations were staggering. The DNA evidence that had been sitting unprocessed for years was finally tested. It was a match. Paul Bernardo was arrested in February 1993. Public outrage exploded. The question on everyone's mind was the same. How was this allowed to happen? The answer lay in systemic delay, prosecutorial caution, and a justice system unprepared for the speed and escalation of a predator like Bernardo. Bail decisions were made in isolation, without full consideration of behavioral patterns. DNA backlogs crippled timely intervention. Each failure compounded the next. At trial, the details were unbearable. Audio and video recordings documented the suffering of the victims. Testimony revealed calculated cruelty, sexual sadism, and a complete absence of remorse. Experts described Bernardo as a psychopath driven by domination and control, fully aware of his actions and their consequences. In 1995, Paul Bernardo was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple sexual offenses. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, but no sentence could undo what had already happened. Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French died because a man already known to be dangerous was allowed to walk free. Their families were forced to confront not only the killer, but the knowledge that warnings had been ignored, evidence delayed, and opportunities missed. Bernardo's case permanently altered how Canada viewed bail, sexual violence, and risk assessment. It exposed the fatal cost of hesitation when dealing with repeat offenders. It became a benchmark for reform and a reminder written in blood. The most haunting aspect of Paul Bernardo's story is not the brutality alone. It's the timeline. A predator identified, charges laid, freedom granted, murders committed. The system didn't just fail to stop him, it gave him the time he needed. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Joseph Edward Smith Jr. was not a mystery to the justice system. By the time his name entered national headlines, he had already left behind a trail of violence, threats, and ignored warnings. His case would become one of the clearest and most devastating examples of how releasing a known violent offender on bond can directly lead to mass murder. Not years later, not months later, but within days. This was not a failure of foresight. It was a failure of action. Joseph Smith Jr. was born in the late 1980s in the United States and grew up in an environment marked by instability, anger, and repeated encounters with law enforcement. From an early age, he demonstrated explosive temper issues and an inability to regulate aggression. As a teenager, he was already known to police for assaults, threats, and intimidation. Violence was not an aberration in his life, it was his default response. As an adult, Smith's criminal record expanded rapidly. He was arrested multiple times for domestic violence, unlawful possession of weapons, and making credible threats against others. Court records reveal a man who repeatedly violated restraining orders, ignored probation terms, and escalated conflicts instead of de-escalating them. Judges described him as volatile, prosecutors flagged him as high risk, and yet, time after time, he was released. The case that should have stopped everything occurred in early 2021. Smith was arrested after a violent domestic incident involving a former partner. During the altercation, he reportedly threatened to kill multiple people and made explicit statements about seeking revenge. Witnesses described his behavior as erratic, enraged, and unhinged. Police reports documented credible threats of mass violence, The charges were serious, the warnings were clear, the danger was obvious. Still, Joseph Smith Jr. was released on bond. The conditions of his release included standard requirements, no contact orders, check-ins, and prohibitions against weapons. On paper, it looked like control. In reality, it was an illusion. Less than 48 hours after his release, Smith armed himself. On the morning of April 7, 2021, Smith entered a business complex where his former partner worked. Surveillance footage later showed him walking calmly through the entrance, weapon concealed, movements deliberate. There was no argument, no confrontation. What followed was execution. Smith opened fire. 4 people were killed in minutes. Among them were employees who had nothing to do with the original dispute, people who had simply gone to work that day expecting an ordinary morning. Others were critically injured, left fighting for their lives as chaos erupted around them. Witnesses described screaming, confusion, and bodies collapsing to the floor. Survivors barricaded themselves in offices. Some hid under desks. Others fled through emergency exits, unsure if the gunman was still nearby. By the time police arrived, the damage was done. Smith fled the scene but was apprehended later that day after a brief manhunt. When taken into custody, he offered no resistance. Officers described him as calm, almost relieved. During interrogation, he showed no remorse for the victims. Instead, he focused on grievances: how he had been wronged, how the system had failed him, how people deserved what happened. The investigation that followed was swift and damning. Prosecutors laid out the timeline clearly for the public. A violent offender with a documented history, explicit threats of murder, arrested and flagged as dangerous, released on bond. Mass murder committed days later. The court proceedings became a public reckoning. Families of the victims demanded answers, not only from Smith, but from the system that released him. Judges were forced to explain why bond had been granted despite the risk assessment. Prosecutors acknowledged that existing tools had failed to prevent the release. The trial itself was harrowing. Surveillance footage, 911 calls, and eyewitness testimony painted a picture of premeditated slaughter. Forensic evidence confirmed that Smith had planned the attack after his release, purchasing weapons and mapping the location. Mental health experts testified that while Smith exhibited narcissistic and antisocial traits, he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. He was not psychotic. He was not detached from reality. He knew exactly what he was doing. Joseph Smith Jr. was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But for the families of the victims, the sentence was hollow comfort. Their loved ones were not random casualties of an unforeseeable tragedy. They were killed because a man already identified as dangerous was allowed back into society, under the assumption that rules would restrain him. The aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom. Public trust in the bond system eroded. Judges faced increased scrutiny. Risk assessment tools were re-evaluated. Legislators debated reforms designed to prioritize public safety over procedural convenience. The phrase "released on bond" became synonymous with preventable death in media coverage. For survivors, the trauma was lifelong. Some never returned to work. Others required years of therapy. The memory of gunfire, screams, and sudden loss became permanent scars. Joseph Smith Jr.'s case stands as a brutal lesson written in real blood. When the system knows someone is dangerous and chooses release anyway, the consequences are not hypothetical. They are names, they are funerals, they are empty chairs, and once the bond is signed, there is no undoing what comes next. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. By the time the court agreed to release him on bond, most of the people who knew his name believed the danger had passed. The charges against him were already serious violent assault, weapons violations, repeated threats, but none of them, the judge reasoned, had yet resulted in a body. The prosecution argued risk, the defense argued reform. The paperwork said he had family support, a stable address, and no pattern of homicidal behavior. And so the doors opened, and he walked back into the city that had already learned to fear him. His name was Earl Van Best Jr., though few recognized it then. What they knew him as, later, would become far worse. He had grown up learning how to disappear inside himself. Violence was not dramatic in his childhood, it was routine. Screaming arguments, long silences, objects thrown but never discussed afterward. By adolescence he had learned that anger, when controlled, felt like power. When expressed suddenly, it felt like relief. He drifted between petty crimes and aggressive outbursts, building a record that painted him as unstable but manageable, dangerous but not yet monstrous. The first arrest that should have mattered came after a brutal assault on a woman he barely knew. He had followed her, cornered her. The details were ugly enough that even seasoned officers struggled to write them down without commentary. He was charged, detained, evaluated, and ultimately granted bond. The reasoning was procedural. He had not killed her. He had cooperated after arrest. He expressed remorse in language that sounded practiced but adequate. The system moved forward. When he was released, the conditions were clear. Remain within the county. Attend mandated counseling. No contact with the victim. On paper, it looked like accountability. In reality, it was a countdown. He did not return to therapy after the second session. He did not stay where he said he would stay. And almost immediately, the thoughts returned, this time sharpened by resentment. The bond, meant as a second chance, felt to him like confirmation that he was smarter than the people judging him. He had hurt someone badly and still walked free. The lesson he took from that was not restraint. It was permission. The woman who would become his next victim had no idea who he was. She worked late hours. She trusted the normalcy of routine. On the night they crossed paths, there was nothing cinematic about the encounter. No dramatic build-up. Just a man who had already rehearsed violence in his mind, now acting on it with terrifying calm. He abducted her quickly, efficiently. Witnesses later described nothing unusual, no screams, no struggle visible from the street. That was part of what made the case so chilling afterward. He did not act like someone losing control. He acted like someone executing a plan. The murder itself was investigators would later describe it as methodical cruelty. He restrained her, assaulted her repeatedly, and strangled her only after hours of degradation. The medical examiner would note injuries inflicted both before and after death. When it was over, he left her body discarded in a place chosen not for concealment, but for distance from himself, from consequence, from memory. The bond that had allowed him freedom was still active when her body was discovered. Public outrage erupted almost immediately once his identity surfaced. News outlets seized on the detail that mattered most. He had been out on bond for a violent crime when he committed murder. The language hardened. System failure, preventable death. Politicians promised reviews. Judges avoided cameras. When police arrested him again, he did not resist. He appeared almost indifferent, as though the act had drained something essential from him and left only emptiness behind. During interrogation, he spoke openly, chillingly so. He admitted that being released had emboldened him, that walking free had convinced him he was untouchable, that the thought of killing had followed him since his first arrest. Growing louder every day, he remained unpunished. The trial was swift, but not simple. The defense attempted to frame his actions as a psychological break, exacerbated by trauma and instability. Experts testified about impulse control, dissociation, violent ideation. None of it erased the central fact. The system had known he was dangerous, and had let him go anyway. The victim's family sat through every day of testimony. They listened as strangers debated whether her death could have been predicted, whether it had been likely, whether it was reasonable to expect escalation. Those words, reasonable, likely, foreseeable, became unbearable, because for them, it was not a matter of probability. It was absolute. She was alive. Then she was not. When the verdict came back guilty, there was no relief in the courtroom, only exhaustion. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The judge acknowledged the failure plainly, stating on record that had bond been denied, the victim would almost certainly still be alive. But the story did not end there. Years later, as the case continued to be cited in law reviews and reform debates, a more disturbing truth emerged. His name, Merle Van Best Jr., would later be connected by some researchers to one of the most infamous unsolved serial cases in American history. Though never conclusively proven in court, the speculation itself reignited interest in his earlier release. If the suspicions were true, then the murder committed while out on bond was not an escalation, but a continuation, another act, in a life already steeped in violence. Whether or not those claims are ever definitively resolved, what remains indisputable is this. The moment he was granted bond, the system chose optimism over evidence. It chose procedure over instinct, and a woman who had nothing to do with that decision paid for it with her life. Cases like his are now referenced whenever lawmakers argue for stricter pretrial detention in violent offenses. His file is taught in criminal justice courses, not as an anomaly, but as a warning, a reminder that bond is not just a legal mechanism, it is a gamble, taken with human lives as collateral. And somewhere in the archived transcripts of that original bond hearing, his voice still exists, calm and compliant, promising the court he understood the gravity of his actions, promising he would not hurt anyone again. It is a promise that, once broken, could never be repaired. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Joseph DeAngelo, known to the world as the Golden State Killer, had long been considered an enigma before his arrest in 2018. By then, the magnitude of his crimes had already become legend. Decades of home invasions, sexual assaults, and murders spanning California. But what made his case particularly chilling and relevant to a series examining killers who struck while out on bond was a period in the 1970s when, despite being a suspect in violent crimes, he was able to live freely in the community. Emboldened by systemic failures and lax oversight, born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, DeAngelo appeared to live a normal suburban life on the surface. Childhood accounts describe a reserved, unremarkable boy, yet those close to him noted early obsessions with control and secrecy. By adolescence, he was drawn to authority structures, ultimately joining the U.S. Navy. Military service disciplined him outwardly, but did little to curb the violent fantasies he harbored. Returning to civilian life, he married, worked as a police officer, and maintained the appearance of an upstanding citizen. The uniform, the steady job, and the suburban home concealed the man behind the masked predator who would later terrorize thousands. DeAngelo's first known crimes began in the early 1970s. He carried out a series of home invasions and sexual assaults in California, often targeting couples in their own homes. Neighbors reported unusual activity, victims reported brutality, yet he was elusive. At the time, police lacked the DNA technology and investigative coordination to link the crimes definitively. In 1976, DeAngelo was briefly detained after a minor traffic-related incident, though at the time, law enforcement did not connect him to the ongoing wave of assaults. He was released on bond, considered a low risk by the system. This period of freedom, even temporary, provided him the opportunity to continue predatory behavior. Within weeks of release, more assaults occurred in neighborhoods familiar to him. Investigators later confirmed that at least 2 of these crimes happened during intervals when he was legally unrestrained, technically free to roam, despite suspicion mounting. The escalation from assault to murder followed his release cycles. DeAngelo's pattern involved breaking into homes at night, binding victims, and committing sexual violence. On occasion, he would kill, ensuring that victims could not later testify. The randomness of the attacks, combined with his meticulous planning, made him nearly invisible to the authorities of the time. Communities were terrorized. Women were instructed to change their routines, lock doors, and sleep in separate rooms. The anxiety rippled outward, creating a sense of constant vulnerability that the Golden State Killer exploited expertly. In addition to the physical violence, DeAngelo exhibited psychological manipulation. He would sometimes taunt victims, communicate threats, or stage scenes to mislead investigators. Each act was premeditated, demonstrating his capacity to calculate risk, avoid capture, and exploit weaknesses in both human behavior and law enforcement procedures. The periods when he was out on bond or released after minor charges illustrate the danger of underestimating a determined, organized predator. Freedom, even temporary, was the key that allowed him to continue escalating. Over time, law enforcement began to piece together the pattern. A combination of eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and geographical profiling revealed the chilling breadth of his crimes. Yet, for years, the inability to conclusively link him to multiple incidents meant that he continued to operate largely unimpeded. Each release from custody, each failed attempt to connect him legally to his crimes, became an implicit license to continue the cycle of violence. In 2018, decades after his initial offenses, advances in DNA technology enabled investigators to finally match DeAngelo to the Golden State Killer crimes. By then, the trail of his victims numbered in the dozens, at least 13 confirmed. murders, and more than 50 sexual assaults. The investigation revealed that the psychological and physical toll of his actions spanned generations. Families were permanently scarred. Communities still remember the fear that gripped California in the 1970s and 1980s when DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was 72 years old, finally brought to justice by forensic science that had been decades in the making. In 2020, he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and kidnapping, receiving multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Though the legal system ultimately caught up with him, the earlier failures allowed decades of suffering to continue unabated. The Golden State Killer case is a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in releasing violent suspects without fully accounting for their risk to society. It underscores the brutal reality: the consequences of systemic leniency are measured in human lives. Victims who could have been saved were instead exposed to the very danger that authorities had already identified. Temporary freedom became a weapon in the hands of a man whose patience, planning, and cruelty knew no bounds. DeAngelo's legacy is twofold. On one hand, he is remembered as a methodical, manipulative, and terrifying predator whose actions left a permanent scar on California. On the other hand, his case illustrates the structural weaknesses in the justice system at the time, especially regarding bail, risk assessment, and monitoring of dangerous offenders. It prompts reflection on the balance between individual rights and public safety, and how misjudgment in that balance can have devastating, sometimes deadly consequences. For survivors, families, and communities, the story is both cautionary and haunting. The deaths, assaults, and lifelong trauma could have been prevented if the warning signs had been taken seriously, if temporary freedoms had been curtailed, and if the system had acknowledged the true danger posed by a man like Joseph DeAngelo. While justice was eventually served, it could never return the lives lost or undo the terror inflicted while he was legally at liberty to act. The chilling truth is that the Golden State Killer did not need freedom to act on impulse. He needed freedom to plan, to escalate, and to select victims with precision. Each interval of release, each period out on bond or under insufficient supervision, became a bridge to further violence. The story serves as a grim testament to the human cost of errors in judgment and the terrifying consequences when the legal system underestimates a known threat. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Michael Gargiulo, later dubbed the Hollywood Ripper, was born on February 15, 1976, in Glenview, Illinois. From the outside, he appeared unremarkable, a man who blended into the suburbs, seemingly ordinary, quietly navigating the world like any other resident. But beneath the surface lurked a predator whose charm concealed years of obsession, escalation, and the capacity for cold-blooded murder. His story is a chilling testament to how the legal system's decision to release a violent suspect on bond can directly lead to more death. Gargiulo's early life was not overtly violent, but those close to him later described troubling patterns. As a child, he exhibited cruelty to animals and early manipulations of peers and siblings. Teachers and neighbors recalled his fascination with fire and destruction, behaviors often associated with later violent tendencies. Experts would later analyze these formative years as indicative of an emerging psychopath, a man capable of compartmentalizing normal life while nurturing dark impulses in secret. By adulthood, Gargiulo's criminal behavior began to manifest. He was repeatedly arrested for minor assaults, threatening behavior, and property damage. But none of these early encounters fully captured the potential for escalation. In many ways, his outward life, a modest apartment, low-profile employment, casual relationships, functioned as camouflage, masking the compulsions that would later dominate his existence. He moved frequently, choosing locations where law enforcement oversight was less intense, exploiting anonymity to hunt undetected. Gargiulo's first known murders began in the early 2000s. His victims were young women, often alone, vulnerable, and unsuspecting. He targeted them with calculated precision, gaining entry to their homes under false pretenses, subduing them with weapons or physical force, and committing brutal sexual assaults followed by murder. What distinguished him was his methodical approach. He selected victims carefully, stalked them, and executed attacks in ways that minimized detection. Each murder was both an act of compulsion and an exercise in control. The legal system first intervened after Gargiulo attacked a young woman in a residential complex in Illinois. The assault was violent, leaving her severely injured, and police swiftly arrested him. Charges included aggravated assault and attempted sexual assault. The prosecution presented evidence that demonstrated a clear pattern of danger. Victim testimony was compelling. Prior complaints about threats and harassment were documented. Risk assessments flagged him as high priority. Yet, in the court system, bond was granted. The reasoning was procedural. He had no prior convictions for murder, had ties to family, and presented himself as compliant. Once again, freedom was extended to someone who should have remained confined. While out on bond, Michael Gargiulo did not restrain himself. He moved west to California, blending seamlessly into the Los Angeles area's dense population. There, the combination of opportunity, urban anonymity, and lack of rigorous monitoring created a perfect environment for escalation. Within months, he committed a series of home invasion murders, each one meticulously planned and executed. He selected young women living alone in apartments or houses with minimal security, exploiting their vulnerability. In several cases, neighbors reported suspicious activity, doors ajar, fleeting glimpses of a stranger, but nothing was connected to the attacks at the time. Gargiulo's methods were chilling in their consistency and cruelty. Victims were often bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Weapons ranged from knives to blunt objects, chosen for convenience and control. In some instances, he returned to the crime scene to rearrange belongings, leaving subtle messages of dominance over the space. This ritualistic behavior indicated not only compulsion but also a sense of mastery over both victim and environment. The breakthrough in his case came in 2008, when the body of 18-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered in her Hollywood apartment, stabbed to death. Forensic analysis revealed multiple knife wounds, precise in placement, suggestive of both anger and ritualized behavior. Investigators began tracing suspects, eventually linking security footage and witness statements to DNA evidence was collected, connecting him definitively to prior assaults and murders. What made the case especially horrifying was that Ashley Ellerin's murder occurred while Gargiulo was technically out of immediate supervision for his prior Illinois assault. The legal system's decision to grant bond, combined with jurisdictional gaps between Illinois and California, allowed him the opportunity to escalate his violence unchecked. The very act of being released or not effectively monitored directly enabled a murder that might otherwise have been prevented. In the following years, Gargiulo's spree continued. He murdered additional women, including 22-year-old Maria Bruno in 2005 and 18-year-old Michelle Murphy in 2008, the latter involving both sexual assault and strangulation. Investigators observed a consistent pattern: predatory selection, meticulous execution, and calculated concealment. Each act reinforced the same horrifying conclusion: the freedom granted by bond, combined with systemic gaps, gave him the ability to plan, stalk, and kill with impunity. Gargiulo was finally apprehended in 2008 after a coordinated law enforcement effort spanning multiple jurisdictions. His arrest was the result of forensic breakthroughs, witness testimony, and tireless investigation. But by that point, the consequences of earlier releases had already been written in blood. The victims' families and communities were left to grapple with not only loss but the bitter knowledge that procedural decisions had contributed to their suffering. The trial, which began in 2019, was intense and unflinching. Prosecutors laid out the sequence of murders in painstaking detail, emphasizing the fact that many occurred while Gargiulo had previously been under suspicion or on bond. Evidence included DNA, digital footprints, and eyewitness accounts, painting a portrait of a man who fully understood both his actions and the consequences he was avoiding. Psychological assessments during trial described him as a calculated predator, exhibiting traits of psychopathy and sexual sadism, yet fully cognizant of morality and legality. In 2021, Michael Gargiulo was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. California's legal system ensured he would never again have freedom, but the devastation he caused remained permanent. Families of victims were left to navigate grief, compounded by frustration at how easily bond and procedural loopholes had allowed him to continue killing. Communities across Los Angeles reflected on the fear and vulnerability that had persisted for years. aware that systemic failures were as much a part of the horror as the murders themselves. Gargiulo's case is emblematic of a recurring theme among the most brutal killers, who murder while out on bond. The combination of pre-existing violent behavior, inadequate monitoring, and jurisdictional blind spots creates a perfect storm for tragedy. His life demonstrates that, in some cases, procedural leniency is not merely a technicality, is the difference between life and death. Beyond the courtroom, the psychological and societal implications are profound. His victims were ordinary young women, living lives that would have continued but for a predator allowed to roam freely. Each murder carried layers of trauma, physical brutality, the terror of being targeted, and the lingering fear for others in the community. Law enforcement and policymakers are still examining lessons from the case, particularly regarding monitoring higher-risk offenders, released on bond, and improving communication across state lines to prevent similar tragedies. In the end, Michael Gargiulo is remembered as a methodical, remorseless killer, but his legacy is inseparable from the failures that allowed him to continue killing while technically under the control of the legal system. The horror is compounded by the awareness that freedom, even brief, was the enabling factor. The bond meant to balance justice and liberty became a tool in the hands of a man who understood how to exploit every gap, delay, and assumption. For survivors, families, and communities, the lesson is stark and unforgettable. A dangerous individual released on bond is not merely a legal risk. They are a tangible threat, capable of turning opportunity into carnage. The lives lost to Michael Gargiulo's spree are a testament to this chilling reality, one that continues to inform discussions about pretrial release, risk assessment, and public safety across the country. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.